Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone. It is a great honor and a pleasure for me to welcome this evening Donald Bates, the Chair of Architecture and Design and Associate Dean for the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. He is the founder and director of Lab Architecture Studio. My name is David Diamond, Director of the Master of Architecture program and Professor in Architecture at the School of Architecture and Design at NYIT. Before introducing our guest, I would like to warmly thank Dean Maria Perbolini for her support in this series of presentations and interviews titled Beyond the Envelope. Many thanks also to NYIT Professor Tom Verabes, who is teaching a third iteration of this Master of Architecture seminar course, within which this series is set. These presentations and interviews could never be launched without the important work of our Lectures and Events Committee, especially Alessandra Mellis, Athena Papadopoulou, and the invaluable administrative support of Susan Sternberg. Today's speaker is Donald Bates, who earned his Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Houston, his Master of Architecture from Cranbrook Academy of Art. He has taught at the Architectural Association, the Cooper Union, and other schools, and he founded and directed the independent architecture school Le PSIA in France from 1990 to 1994. In 1994, Professor Bates and Peter Davidson founded Lab Architecture Studio, and in 1997, Lab won the competition for Federation Square in Melbourne. Lab has designed award-winning large-scale commercial, cultural, civic, and residential projects with built works in Australia, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And Professor Bates has lectured at more than 250 schools of architecture and has been published extensively in journals and magazines. He has been a jury member or chair of more than 28 international architectural design competitions. The project in focus for this evening's presentation and interview is Federation Square, completed in 2002 in Melbourne, Australia. The title for this evening's presentation is The Ins and Outs of Over and Under. The project for Federation Square between 1997 and 2002, as both a design competition and eventually as a built project, remains essentially a study in spatial order and organization. In the urban design, the architectural planning and programmatic arrangements, and in the fractal facade, the catchphrases of coherence and difference, permeability, and offset shift were speculations and provocations as much as guiding principles. Federation Square sits on an 8-acre site, roughly the size of New York City's Bryant Park. The brief called for a precinct of diverse cultural, civic, and commercial programs, and had been mandated to achieve Melbourne's long-term aspiration for a new public square, combined with an interactive assembly of art gallery, screen-based media center, public radio and television broadcast facilities, and performance venues. It was also tasked with linking the Cartesian grid of the central business district with the neglected riverside of the Yarra River, all spanning above 13 sets of working railway tracks. Fed Square was conceived in a period marked by global aspirations for the economic benefit of iconic architecture, or the Bilbao effect. But the non-iconic spatial and material complexities of Federation Square sought a more experiential, more engaged, more lived impact beyond the postcard captured moment. The project strategies of overlap, offset, shifting elements generated organizational complexity and plan, and subtle figurative opportunities in the facades and elevations. Generated in the transitional infancy of digital architecture, Federation Square continues to be a landmark of architectural design methodologies. Since its completion in 2002, this seminar class, has the opportunity to reflect on the promises and controversies surrounding Fed Square's opening 20 years ago. So the format of these events will be a brief presentation by the architect, followed by a student-led interview. I am now pleased to introduce Master of Architecture final year student Kashmir Savin Shah, who will conduct this interview with Donald Bates following his presentation. Please join me to warmly welcome to New York Tech, Donald Bates.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, both for the introduction, but also for the opportunity to be part of this event and part of this series. And I really want to thank Tom Verbis, who's a longtime friend of mine, and in fact was one of my students at the school that I ran in France. So we go back some time. I'm going to jump into the presentation fairly quickly. I know that we only have a certain amount of time to get through, so I'm going to jump in and begin fairly quickly with the project so that we have enough time to have some discussion afterwards. I also want to just say a quick hello to Pablo, who's another good friend that I taught with at Cooper Union, so it's good to see Pablo there as well. Okay, as was mentioned, this is a project of Lab Architecture Studio. This is the project that the company, the architectural practice that Peter Davidson, as you see here, and myself started back in 1994. Peter was from Australia and was in London. I was from Texas and in London. So as outsiders, we didn't really have any kind of background or big network. So most of our projects, in fact, all of our projects for the first 5 or 6 years were done as competitions. And so when we did a few competitions in Australia, we didn't win anything. We got shortlisted on one before. But when the presentation or the competition, the international competition for Federation Square came, we thought we would give it a try. But all of this work took place out of London. This gives you an image. This is an image from about 1996. So the Melbourne background that you see of the CBD district, just to the north of the railway and of the river, looks very different today. There's a lot more high-rise buildings that have been built. Melbourne is now approaching close to 4.5 million people. It will be the largest city in Australia in the coming years, and is a very dynamic city, and its architecture is very dynamic. Anyway, this orange quadrilateral that you see there, it was the site. It's effectively over the railway lines. It's the size of a city grid in Melbourne. The city grids in Melbourne, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do this in metric. The city grids are 220 meters long by 110 meters wide. So a very large grid compared to when I lived in Houston, where the city grid is only 70 meters by 70 meters. So a very distinct difference in terms of the urban morphology. Anyway, these are just some of the documents that were part of the competition. As you can see on the sort of left-hand side, that's the area that they called Federation Square Precinct. It also shows, and again, this is just from the competition documents, it shows a kind of public plaza to the front of it, facing across to the main railway station, and with St. Paul's Cathedral, the main Anglican cathedral, to the north. And that was a sort of sense of just continuing the grid, the Cartesian grid of the CBD, down until it reaches to the riverside. This is a photograph again from that period, so you can see the site just there to the north of the river. And you can see the kind of, again, the grid and morphology of the central business district. There had been other competitions. I'll just run through these quickly, just some images. There had been other projects to build what is now at Federation Square, but they had never come to fruition. And so the competition was really to build over the railways. It was called Federation Square because it was to celebrate 100 years of the founding of the Federation of Australia in 1901. So the idea was that this project would be completed by 2001. It was actually completed a year longer than that. But as you can see, there's this, the point of showing this is to show the yellow framing of the CBD, and then and the kind of order that has with the grid. But our site is outside the grid. And it was important to realize that, because it gave a sense that we didn't have to follow that Cartesian order. And not only is it outside, but it's also related to the fact that the railways that run through here have another kind of logic, another kind of formal arrangement and such, as well as the river, which being an alluvial river meant that historically it had also shifted and changed. So for us, this was a kind of zone of flux, which is different than the CBD. And also, if you see over on the right-hand side, there's a whole series of sports facility. This is where the Australian Open takes place. There's a large football stadium for Australian rules football and cricket, which holds 100,000 people. But it just seemed to us that we could operate in a very different way than that. This is what we did the work on. This is our computer at the time. This is a Mac SE30. This was the most advanced computer you could buy of your own back in the day, back in 1997. So this was just at the very beginning for us of using any sort of digital tools. But my digital tool and the tools that we use were things like Illustrator. They weren't drawing programs or architectural drawing programs. In doing the kind of analysis about the grid and such, we thought about something like a tartan, which is a pattern, but it's actually got a lot of complexity in the overlap of colors, overlap of strands. You get this, but we wanted to do something more than that. And so we inputted this into the little computer, into Illustrator. We redrew a tartan pattern into Illustrator. And then with some of the functions, some of the filters in Illustrator, we started to change it. So this is a kind of outcome of taking that tartan grid and manipulating it and distorting it, so to speak. And then out of that, a series of hand drawings. So taking from those distortions, those twists, those shifts, a series of drawings to try to come up with a sense of order that was different from the CBD grid. We did other kind of drawings, like here with folded tracing paper. We were just trying to understand what happens when these filaments, these lines, these sort of bands of paper overlap and you get increased senses of densities, and that those densities produce a kind of visual differentiation of how a space might be organized. These are just lots of images of drawings that we worked on, working back and forth to see these filaments and how they might exist. These are from the office, again, both Peter and myself drawing these, but also everybody else in the office was working through these projects like this. We were interested in the way in which in architecture, the line is really the thing that makes difference, that when you draw a line, you're notating differences. You're notating the difference between stone and glass, the difference between inside and outside, the difference between this is mine and that's yours, the difference between one kind of experience and another. And so we were also trying to do drawings that weren't just about lines where there was an overlap or a fading or a transition between one tone or one tonality and another, or color and so on and so forth. So these were the kind of works that we were trying to look at and the kind of spatialization of what that might mean. It was a two-stage competition. This was a model from the first stage. We were fortunate to get shortlisted with 4 other practices. And then from that, we developed it further. And this ended up being our second stage model that we submitted and then came and did a presentation to the jury. And then over time, and this was after the announcement, the man in the middle with his hand raised was the premier, the sort of governor, you might say, of the state of Victoria. And then this was the model after we had won, and some other additions had been noticed. So between the competition and the actual project, a big section, which is the building closest to the right-hand side, which is the National Gallery of Victoria, Australian art, was added and it hadn't been part of the competition. This is just showing it. I'm just showing this as a kind of background to the project as a whole, because what I really want to talk about are the facades and the atrium structure. But this is it as a kind of completed project in the context of the city. This is it as a built project. So this is pretty much what it was in 2002 when the project was finished. You can see it within the context of the city. And within the riverside and the train station to the east, to the west of the project. And these are just some images of the external facades. This is again looking back at the plaza. and the kind of space of the plaza. The plaza is a kind of double ground. That is to say, it starts at ground level, but by the time you're at the far end of the plaza, you're actually one level above the street. And there's an entry point from Flinders Street, which is the street to the north, that comes in. So it's a kind of double ground. This was not long after. This was in February of 2003, which was where the first anti-war march against the invasions of Iraq took place, when the space that we were supposed to design that would hold up to 15,000 people was sort of overrun by 35,000 people. And the architecture just sort of disappears. But it has been a place, it does fit its civic role of being a place for disputation, for protest march, for strikes. This is one of the unions complaining about working privileges within the state. It's where celebration takes place. This is when Australia was in the World Cup some years ago, and you would have 20,000 people at 3 o'clock in the morning watching the Olympics or the World Cup on the stage. These are other events that take place there, things like the New Year's Eve celebrations that take place there, and a more recent photograph within the context of the city. Wanted to really focus on this thematic around coherence and difference. And what I meant by that is partly because it's a response to the project. That is to say, the project is a precinct as a whole thing, Federation Square. So it's not just the public square, it's a precinct with cultural buildings, art gallery, multimedia, screen-based exhibition space, and museum. It has a performance venue. It has offices for radio and television. It has other venues and spaces in terms of food and beverage and some commercial facilities like bookshops and so on and so forth. So there is where the sort of precinct wants to have some sense of coherence. But at the same time, it is made up of these differences. An art gallery is very different to a cinema, which is very different to the broadcasting studios, which is very different to the offices for some of the arts management and such, which is different again. So this question of how to create coherence where things tie together, and yet where we also can articulate and enunciate differences, difference in program, difference in environmental conditions, difference in orientation and aspect, and so forth. And I guess the first thing when we thought about it, again, back in London, not in Melbourne, but back in London in doing the competition design, was also in relationship to the facades and the degree to which, in kind of modernist technology, we have buildings that are either mostly in terms of a facade, there's a kind of orientation of horizontality, or perhaps it's oriented vertically, or, you can see it's a kind of rectangular grid or a square grid of some kind or another. And this whole question of what is that as a kind of facade. I had studied at Cranbrook with Daniel Libeskind, and then I worked with him as an associate when he was doing the competition for what was then the Berlin Museum, has now been called the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And one of the aspects of that was, that was still there with me is this sense of, well, what is a facade? What does a facade do? What kind of articulation can it have? Does it need that kind of ordered grid which seems to be about utility and ease of construction and regularity and repetition versus the kind of unique articulation of a surface like you see in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And then the consequence of that, what does that mean for an interior when you don't have a ordered gridded structure on the outside or on the facade, and what's that mean for the interior? As I said, we did this project in London. Peter and I were both there in London. Peter had a small office. I had mostly been teaching at the Architectural Association. And so we used Peter's office there. And one of the really good things, these yellow dots, so the top left-hand side, that's where the office was. Almost directly across from it was the offices of the structural engineering group called Atelier 1. And then at the bottom of the image, the yellow rectangle, is where the offices for the environmental services engineers, Atelier 10, were. And these were friends of ours. We had done other competitions with them. They were literally just around the corner or across the street, in fact. And the day that we got the competition documents was also the time that we gave a copy to the engineers. So they were with us from day one. And we were working through various aspects, both on the building as a whole, but particularly, this is looking from our office across to the building where Atelier 1 had their offices. And this is Neil Thomas, who's the director of Atelier 1, really great engineer, one of the most amazing ones. They're the engineers of this piece by Anish Kapoor in Chicago. They think very differently than just maybe some regular engineers. They're also the engineers on this project that they did also with Atelier 10 in Singapore, Gardens by the Bay, and these big greenhouses by Wilkinson Eyre, the architects, but amazing sort of structural solutions that they had on this. So these were the kind of people that were working with. They also did this project again with Atelier 10 of the Esplanade Theaters, also in Singapore. And you can sort of see a detail on the right-hand side. So this structure, which has this kind of very unique sort of array of surfaces, are also shading devices. And they're quite simply just a folded plate, but they create a different articulation, and that fold can be compressed for a different angularity as a sun shading device. So you get this patterning that comes of it. So these are the guys that we're working with really from day one. And so as we're developing the project, we would take a drawing like this, walk across the street and say, okay, we're thinking about this for a facade. What do you think? And they'd say, well, what is it? What is the black an opening, or is the black solid? Is the white some kind of pattern? What is the grid and stuff? And we'd take another drawing like this and say, well, what about this for a facade? Because we were trying to get away from the kind of gridded rectangular facades. We were trying to come up with a device that would allow us a great degree of figuration and differentiation. Again, both a coherence of something that held together, but something that could articulate differences in some way or another. And we said we'd take on this image and say, we want a facade that does this, that goes from being a bird to being a fish without a line, that there's not a line that you can draw that says, this is when it's no longer a fish and this is when it's a bird. So this drawing by Escher, where there is a change. There's a change from one material to a different material, one form to a different form, but you can't really draw the line. There's a zone of transition, but you can't quite draw the line. So we were interested in the possibility, the architectural possibility of transitioning from one material to another, one sort of figuration to another, one way in which a surface can be articulated where that transition is almost indecipherable. One day they came back to us and said, well, what about this? This is a tiling system by the mathematician John Conway, who used to be at Princeton. Unfortunately, he passed away because of COVID. But he created this tiling system, which is called the Conway pinwheel grid. And it's an aperiodic tiling system, which means even though it's made up of a singular element, a triangle, a golden ratio triangle, as it were, that the way in which they fit together can be endlessly differentiated. In other words, it doesn't repeat at a certain point. It comes out of a simple figure of the golden ratio, so that you have, a side that's 2 times the length of one side, so that the third side is root 5. And what happens within this is that you start with a triangle and you can subdivide it, and then again. So one triangle plus 4 other triangles keeps generating a similar congruent set of triangles that are endlessly morphing and moving through. This is why we called it a fractal facade. So you start with a single triangle, put 4 other triangles together, and you get a self-similar triangle, and so forth. So you can either make it additive or you can do it by subdivision in terms of increasing that. So we start with a surface that has this sort of patination. But what it also meant was, from a fabrication point of view, it allowed us to, in the same sort of surface, as it were, to be able to articulate different figurations of a surface, because it's just in a way selecting how many of these triangles form a group. And within that same surface, that same pattern, you can have lots of different groupings and therefore different figurations. So from a structural point of view or a fabrication point of view, it's very mathematically defined. So taking one triangle and adding it with it 4 other triangles of the same material, they're all put together on an aluminum frame. So they're all attached. You can see in this working drawing, this is actually showing one with a piece of stone where you can see the attachments to an underlying aluminum frame. Then you take that, so when we have it as a single panel, a single triangle that you would see, we call that a tile. And when you put 5 tiles together, you get a panel. And you would put 5 panels together, you get a mega panel. And these 5 panels that are held, that have an aluminum frame, are attached then to a steel frame. And all of this is done in the factory. So all of this is prefabricated in the factory. So even though we're trying to create a facade with a great degree of variation and differences, and yet also allow it to be prefabricated because of its geometric order. So these are some of the steel frames that the panels would go onto. So these are the steel frames for the mega panels. And this is one of those mega panels. So this is the panel that's been brought from the factory and is waiting to be put up on the facade. It just so happens on this panel, all of the tiles, that is to say, all of the singular triangles, are made out of sandstone. But each of the 5 groups, so there are 5, so there are 5 panels fitting onto this mega panel, and each panel is made up of 5 triangles, and they just happen to be sandstone in this instance. This drawing shows all of the facades of the buildings that use the fractal facade or the pinwheel grid. And you can see there's also a differentiation. So the top 2 bands are the panels and the facades for the museum, for the National Gallery of Victoria, Australian art. And they were basically composed by Peter, my colleague. The middle band is for the SBS, which is the broadcasting service, and what's now called the ACMI, the Australian Centre for the Moving Image. I was in charge of those, so that patination is ours. And then the third, the last row at the very bottom, which is on what's called the Yarra building, was done between Peter and myself and a group of others in the office. This is the building. You can see it's still under construction in this photograph, but you can see it in some kind of comparison to the buildings in the background of the CBD. And so all of that surface and that surface differentiation. So we have zinc, we have perforated zinc, we have the sandstone, and there are some glass, which are also in the triangular grid pattern. This shows it coming together, and particularly on the building for SBS, the Special Broadcasting Service, because it's actually an office building. People are in there working. They need to be able to sit out. So the facade here in perforated zinc, some aspect, this is from inside the offices looking through the facade. On this image, we're actually facing to the north, which is where the sun is in the Southern Hemisphere. And so it's really acting as a shading device from the sun. The other thing that happens is that within that geometry of the pinwheel grid, every once in a while, you get a kind of alignment of the geometries. And where those triangles align, you get a kind of folding point. You get a fold that happened, which meant that the facades are not extrusions from the ground up or from one plan upwards. They actually bend and fold and articulate. So you can see here, this is on the National Gallery of Victoria. There's a fold that takes place in the facade because there's a staircase behind that runs from the upper level of the galleries down to the ground. And so once we've covered that, staircase, then the facade can fold back in so that you get this as a result of where that's articulated. This is on the back side, again, of the National Gallery of Victoria, and you can see with the shadows and such, you can see how that surface is not flat. it's articulating in and out. And again, there's also even the slight difference between the thickness of the stone. The stone is about 2.5 inches thick, let's say. And then sometimes the zinc, which is, just a millimeter or so thick on a frame, sometimes the zinc is flush to the top surface, and sometimes it's flush to the lower surface of the sandstone. So you also get a secondary patination of shadow lines between the difference between 2.5 to 3 inches of difference. And as I said, sometimes we have offices. And so within the same system with perforations and even leaving panels off of the building, we have the possibility of views to the outside. These other images that I showed just before, these are for the National Gallery. These are galleries for art. So we don't have natural daylight going into those spaces. The same thing happens when it's for the cinema, but then we also do have it where we have offices. So the same system, again, this sense of a coherence also allows for difference. And you can see in this one on the left-hand side, this is the building that has the cinemas, and the building on the right-hand side are the offices for SBS, the broadcasting service. And this is the facade that we were looking through that's facing towards the north. This is the National Gallery facade, and you can see it above the railways there, and how it changes from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, where on the left-hand side, we have a lot more zinc and less sandstone. And then on the right-hand side, we have more sandstone and a little bit less zinc. Now, coming out of that from the facade, so I'll just check the time, is also a major structure, which is called the atrium, which is a large open space. The plaza is where lots of these public events, as I showed before, but we also needed a large public space that could be covered, because in the wintertime in Melbourne, it's quite rainy, it's a bit cold, it doesn't snow, but it's still quite cold and stuff. And there are lots of public events that happen in Melbourne. So the atrium was that space that would allow for public gatherings, but with some protection to it. And so we used, again, the Conway pinwheel grid, but now as a three-dimensional structure. And we ended up with this kind of thing. So this is the entrance, again, from the north. And the other important thing was that there was no front door. That is to say, it couldn't be closed. So that this public space, which is a connection from the city, from the CBD, which is to the north, all the way down to the river, is open 24 hours a day, every day of the year. There is no way to close it off. And that produced some issues in terms of ventilation and such. But really just to talk about the structure itself. So you can see this on the right-hand side is the CBD, that's the downtown of Melbourne. And on the left-hand side, just a little bit beyond the drawing, would be the river. And so it's over the railways, but it's making also that transition from the city to the river or vice versa. And so it starts to step down once we're no longer above the railways. This structure is about 110 meters long, so that's what, 350 feet. And it's about 18 meters across and 17 meters high in terms of internal volume. So we started off with the Conway grid. We started off with the triangular grid, and then we started to manipulate it. Because what, again, working with Atelier 1 particularly, we realized that as a kind of space frame, which if you have the grid, the Conway grid fully articulated as that triangular grid, effectively produces a kind of three-dimensional space frame. But as within any space frame, not all the elements are doing the same job, even though they're all the same size or all the same dimension and such. So we started looking at what it would mean to start taking bits and pieces out. And so you can see in this model that there's a kind of surface. So the space frame itself forms a portal frame. That is to say, it's got a depth of about 1.5 to 2 meters. And within that provides its stability. So we don't have things like central columns and then beams spanning across. It's acting as a space frame and as a portal frame. But you can see that there are places where it just gets dropped out because the forces move from the external surface or the outside surface towards the inside surface in terms of where the loads are being carried. This is the makeup of it. So in the middle, we have that kind of, like in the model you just saw, the kind of space frame. And then we have two surfaces of glass. We have glass on the outside and we have glass on the inside. And all of that glass is laid out in the triangular pattern. These are some of the component parts that you see. These are some of the details. So even though it looks quite chaotic to a certain degree, there are actually these joints, the joints which became the critical piece, there's only something like 9 different joints. And then you have the pieces that connect. And out of that, again, there are only something like 6 or 7 different links of that join together. But it is in those joints that the complexity exists. These are just some of the sketches of trying to work through what piece is doing what. It's really in the connections because we're making wells that are, not just in a horizontal, which are already complex because of the angles, but then when it joins together three-dimensionally, that becomes quite complicated in terms of how these pieces come together. It's all galvanized, and it all had to fit together within a tolerance of 4 millimeters or so. Some of the grids that are working through. So I'll just go to this image, it probably helps. So what we end up with is a kind of almost like a trellis system where you have the structural grid, the structural frame, and then you have the layers of glass on the inside and layers of glass on the outside. So you get these multiple layers of material where the structural grid, as well as then the framing for the glass. And even though it looks quite chaotic, there are only 5 different shapes of glass. But because it's part of a triangular grid, these shapes, which might be 5-sided or 4-sided or 6-sided, rotate. And therefore, it looks more complex than it actually is. So these are the kind of events that take place within that structure. So that structure that goes from the city, which is to the north, and acts as a kind of covered walking space, a transition from the city down to the river, but is also an event space where lots of different activities take place on a kind of weekly basis, some that repeat, some that are once off, and so forth. And as it makes that transition from the city down towards the riverside, then we ended up with this space, which was, again, just trying to literally make the transition down to the level of the river. But we couldn't start it until right where the seating is, because before that, we have to have a clearance above the railways. But then once we can start to cascade down, it turns into an event performance space. Now, originally, when we were looking at this, it was just going to be a place where maybe there'd be a few events and stuff. But our acoustics engineers looked at this grid and said, well, if we started allowing some of the glass to actually fold into the sort of portal frame dimension, that thickness, and we could even leave some, we could acoustically tune the space. So they started working on it, and we were able to turn this into a music venue. So we can have chamber orchestra music in here. So it's both a public space for lots of public events, but also for music events as well. And because it's just coming directly in from the street, it means it's a very democratic space. That is to say, you come in from the street and you walk through and suddenly you're part of a conversation about sustainability, about race relationships, about the voice for the Aboriginal people of Australia. Okay, I'll finish there. So I'll stop sharing and hopefully we can have a conversation.
My name is Kashmir Shah, and I'd like to thank you for insightful and engaging presentation. So the Federation Square project elicits association between the role of civic architecture to patterns of urban space and the relationship between discrete institutional buildings and the city. It has been published, and you have presented how this project recapitulates the urban order of the 19th century fabric of Melbourne's narrow laneways, blocks, and streets. You published a sketch diagram of figure and field relationships, which you have just shown this evening in your presentation, suggests the subversion of the legitimacy of building figures and also hints at narrow routes into and through the field. While in London, in the early design stages of the project, how was this diagram instrumental in the design of the massing figures and public routing of the urban pattern of Federation Square?
Well, we did, to be honest, we did lots and lots of diagrams. I mean, we were interested, I mean, I would say some of our research was looking at the work of Stan Allen. Stan Allen wrote a book that talked about kind of field order, or orders that are not based on geometries, sort of classical geometries, or axial planning, or centrifugal plans, or so on and so forth. So we were interested in that work. The drawings that I showed you, which came from taking the tartan pattern and distorting it, were part of it. Part of it was the folding of the tracing papers you saw. We also looked at thin rock sections. So if you take a piece of rock and cut it very thin and then shine light through it, or ultraviolet light, or various kind, you pick up the sort of matrix of different minerals that are bound together. And at first it looks completely chaotic, but actually when you study it, you realize there are orientations. That is to say, some of the grains and some of the minerals are oriented in a particular direction. And out of that, you start to see that there is another kind of order. So that question of how to create order not based on pure geometries was really important for us. And from our point of view, what was important about it in terms of architecture was in creating a kind of relational design. That is to say, where what we were trying to design were not specific figures that look like particular things, or that were based on a kind of purity of a grid, but what we were trying to design were the relationships. And so we could move and push the relationships, and as they change, because as the program change, then we could understand how the project could be organized. So, and as the project did change, and it changed multiple times, like for instance, the National Gallery of Victoria, which in fact is the biggest facility on the site, was not part of the competition. So we had to rethink the project when we won the project. And so we didn't have a strict image of a figure. It was really about this kind of constant reshifting of relationships. And then things like budgets would change, and floor area would change, and the brief would change. And what we were designing were the relationships, not an object that looked like something particular.
At what stage in the design conception of the project did the concept of Melbourne's urban fabric of lanes arise? Was the relationship to Melbourne's urban pattern a conscious decision, or did your diagram of figure-to-field relationships imply an association to Melbourne?
Yeah, so when we did the competition, I'd never been to Melbourne. I mean, Peter had, because he studied in Sydney and went to UTS in Sydney, but he had come to Melbourne a few times for conferences or various other things. So he knew a little bit about Melbourne and its laneways and passageways. But in the 80s and into the early 90s, the laneways and the arcades and passageways were kind of, it's not that they weren't known, but they weren't very articulated in terms of people really appreciating it. And it was only in the mid-90s that people started to move back into the downtown of Melbourne. Melbourne is very similar. I mean, historically, it's from the same time as Houston. It's very similar, where it has a very dense, ordered downtown, and then huge suburban sprawl that goes on forever. And in the 70s and the 80s into the early 90s, nobody lived downtown. It was just where people went to work. But that started to change in that notion of it. But when we did the competition, I didn't know about the laneways, and Peter only knew about them a little bit. But when that sense of order was something we had already been working on other competitions before Federation Square. So there just happened to be a good meshing between those. When we got to the second stage, we had to form a joint venture with a local practice in Melbourne called BATES Smart, nothing to do with me, just happens to be the same name. And they sent 2 people to London to work with us on the second stage of it. And I wouldn't say that the design changed in any way because of that, but we could articulate that actually this did have something to do with Melbourne's character, even though it seemed quite different and quite not like Melbourne. At the same time, it actually had that sensibility. And that's why, for me, Melbourne is a city of experiences. And it's very different to Sydney, which is a city of images. You know, if you go to Sydney, you have to stand and take the photograph of the Opera House and the bridge and the harbor all together, and then you can say you've been to Sydney. There's not a place in Melbourne where you can stand and say, well, this is Melbourne. It's something you have to participate in. And our design for Federation Square as a precinct was a precinct of experiences that you moved through it. So we have arcades and we have laneways and we have zones that you move through, and that it makes sense by being there, not by looking at it.
The atrium of Federation Square, which serves as a public thoroughfare interiorizing urban space, renders more complex the relationships of figure and field, mass and routing. Was the space part of the competition brief, or what stage was it included as a feature in the earlier design stages?
Yeah, it was part of the competition. It wasn't called the atrium. They had a term called a winter garden, which basically meant, you know, it was to be that kind of space that you could go into and you could have events in when it's windy and it's cold and it's wet and so on and so forth. But they didn't really know what it was. I mean, for a lot of competitors, it was a kind of commercial zone. It was where you would have cafes and restaurants and shopping and so on and so forth. We saw it as this connector because there was, before Federation Square being built over the railway, there was no connection from the city, the CBD, to the north, down to the river, except at bridges. So the street that's to the west of Federation Square, which is called Swanston Street, it's the main thoroughfare that goes through from the south to the north through the CBD. It's actually a bridge because the railways are passing underneath, and the next street down is a bridge, and so on and so forth. So by building Federation Square as a precinct, it also made the first time a whole block that connected the city to the river. So when we were designing the atrium, we really saw it as a kind of covered street, as a way to get from the city to the river. But we also saw it particularly as, and this was much more when we started working on the design, less than the competition, we began to see how it could form a role as a venue at the same time. So both the space you pass through, but also the space you go into, and particularly in the south atrium, which is where we have what's called the Edge, this performance venue. And it was really with the help of the acoustics engineers that it went from being just a kind of generic space to a highly articulated space with incredible acoustic qualities. And yet you can see people rowing on the river while you're listening to a concert at the same time. And it was part of, I mean, and again, as I mentioned, you know, it was very important for us that there wasn't a door, that it wasn't closed, that you know, it couldn't be closed off, because it was important for it to have that civic quality. It wasn't like inside a shopping mall where you close it at night and it's privatized. It was really important that it had that kind of civic role. And the consequence of that was then we had to figure out how to heat it or cool it, and to do that economically, which is where the group Atelier 10, as the environmental services engineers, came up with something called the Labyrinth, which is a passive cooling system. So we can passively cool the whole thing, even though it's all glass and it's all open.
Civic spaces associated with the comprehensive arts and cultural venues, also often referred to as cultural districts, have the potential to become symbols of their host city. The Federation Square project has been suggested as Melbourne's equivalent to Sydney Opera House, and you have presented the context of the 1990s Bilbao effect within which the project was designed. When working on the project, did you imagine the civic and cultural space of Federation Square could attain the status of a symbol of the city?
Well, it's interesting because in the competition documents, I mean, there were about 100 and I think there were 174 entries for the competition for Federation Square from around the world, because it was an international open competition. And in the competition documents, there was a kind of aspiration that, you know, Melbourne was looking for its opera house. Melbourne was looking for that kind of architectural image. And this was in the time of Bilbao. And so this idea that a piece of architecture could define a whole city was certainly part of the discourse that was going on. We weren't particularly interested in that. I mean, we didn't see that. And if anything, our analysis was that it wanted to not be iconic in the sense of being a single figure. What it wanted to be was a destination of experience, a place that people would go to, not to look at it and take that one photograph, but to actually have to discover it and such. And so, you know, the work, so to speak, was in how to you know, let people enjoy it as a place and not feel disappointed because it's not iconic enough. And you know, I'd have to say, I mean, we were very lucky in one sense because there was a jury and the jury awarded it to us. The premier, the man that you saw in the photograph pointing at the model, he didn't like our project at all. And he wanted one of the others to be the winner, but he said, well, I appointed the jury, so I have to take their recommendation. When Federation Square finally opened, it's had 10 million visitors every year since it opened, except maybe during COVID, obviously. So, you know, they had hoped, you know, that it might have something like 4 to 5 million visitors a year, and it's had 10 million visitors a year for 20 years. It's already been, I think it was 4 years ago, it was given heritage status. So less than 20 years old, and it was given heritage status, which is a problem for me because it means we can't change anything. You know, if we wanted to change the handrails outside, we'd have to get permission from the heritage minister to see if we could do anything. But it also, I think the other, just try to add a little bit to answer to your question, is Melbourne has an arts precinct on the south side of the river. So just across the river and a little bit to the west of Federation Square is the arts precinct, and it's called South Bank. And in Brisbane, across the river from the downtown, they have an arts precinct, which is called South Bank. And in London, across the river from Westminster, is the arts precinct in London called South Bank. So you have this history of these arts precincts. I mean, we would call it the kind of Acropolis effect, where you separate out the arts. I mean, the same thing in New York with Lincoln Center, you know, you have a precinct of a concert hall, a theater space, a performance space, a gallery, and so on and so forth. And it's as if by putting it all together, you create this one domain of culture. We didn't want to do that. I mean, first of all, our site is not like that, but part of the design, this kind of permeability that's in the design, was to say, no, we want the art and the culture to be part of everyday life. It's not a place you just go to once or twice a year with your grandmother. It's a place you go through on the way to someplace else. It's a place you pass on the way to the football or to the tennis and such. And so part of that shifting grid of Federation Square was to try to induce this sense not of singular buildings that you go into for a cultural or a civic experience and then come back out again, but it's a kind of permeable matrix that you pass through, around, and in, and it's part of everyday life.
Many cultural districts, London South Bank, for example, are grown and evolved over time, expanding with buildings and institutions added over time. Other cultural districts are built at one time, such as New York's Lincoln Center. Federation Square was commissioned to have been completed in 2002. Interestingly, one of the buildings, the Yarra building, was recently demolished and an Apple shop was built in its place. Can you please comment on how you view this development of the site, which changed your initial design?
Well, actually, that didn't quite happen. So there was a proposal to the Yarra building, which is the one that's closest to the riverside, to be replaced and to have an Apple store there. It didn't happen. And part of why it didn't happen was because the Federation Square got heritage status. I mean, there was a lot of opposition. There was a lot of opposition from different sectors across Melbourne against that, mostly because it was Apple. They didn't want a big American technology company. What people thought would be they would take over the kind of image of Federation Square. So that project didn't happen. Nonetheless, there is a current project that's going on right now. Melbourne is building a new metro line, an underground train line. And one of the stations is just to the north of Federation Square, but one of the entry points into the station is through Federation Square. And so some of our buildings, at least one of our buildings, which was called the Western Shard, have been demolished, and a new entrance point is being built, which is not by our design. It's actually by the Richard Rogers company. So it's a kind of funny situation where there was a proposal to change. Personally, myself, I didn't have a huge problem. I didn't like the design by Foster for the Apple store, but the idea of Federation Square changing was not, I wasn't against that necessarily. And I didn't believe, I mean, we always said when we designed it that, you know, Federation Square, it's important to understand the 3 C's of it, which is that it's a civic site, that it's a cultural site, but it also is a commercial site. And for us, this is because to make public space work, it needs a commercial component. It needs cafes, it needs restaurants, it needs places to hang out and stuff. It needs that animation when a cultural event isn't happening. So we had no problem. And in fact, we advocated strongly for a whole range of cultural, commercial facilities to be part of it, because we think that's what makes public space. You know, and this is why it's interesting when you look at South Bank in Melbourne, Brisbane, and London. They all had beautiful venues, but they were dead 90% of the time. You know, the opera is only on for 2.5 hours a night, and the rest of the time the building is completely blank. Now they've been changed, all of those places. And you mentioned the transitions of the South Bank in London. They've all had added bookshops and cafes and restaurants, which have livened them up compared to when I first went there back in the 70s, and certainly when I lived in London in the early 90s and 80s. You know, it really changed all of that. And so, you know, the project for the Apple shop to me was a part of that possibility. Now, the fact that it didn't happen doesn't bother me. And in fact, that building has now been, is being renovated in the inside to become a bigger version of what's called the Koori Heritage Trust. And the Koori Heritage Trust is the indigenous, it's for the indigenous people of Victoria, which go by the name of Koori as a kind of name. So that building itself, which was originally designed without a specific tenant in mind, was not part of the competition. We added that building because we felt we needed a building there to help formulate the plaza as a kind of backdrop, and also to provide venues at ground level for activation, which is still there in terms of cafes and restaurants and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's been enhanced by the development of the Koori Heritage Trust, and will become another destination for people there.
In the AD issue, Architecture After Geometry, guest edited together with Peter Davidson in 1997, some months before you had both started working on the Federation Square project. You had argued for a shift in emphasis in architecture from geometry towards pattern. In the Federation Square project, your deep interest in the relationships between geometry, pattern, and organization is evident in the unrelenting difference and the denial of repetition in both the urban fabric and the surface expression of the project. Further to your presentation, the Federation Square project is one of the very few buildings built with notions of fractal geometry and self-similarity to embedded multiple scales as a basis to achieve coherence and difference. In retrospect, some 25 years after starting the project, can you situate the Federation Square within the larger shift towards complexity in architecture in late 1990s?
Yeah, look, I mean, certainly, I mean, the issue of AD that we did, architecture after geometry, you know, that was sort of what we were looking at, but we were looking at it because of a lot of our friends and colleagues, you know, people like Greg Lynn, people like Jeff Kipnis, you know, Reiser and Omamoto. I mean, these were, first of all, friends, people I either went to school with or knew or taught next to at the AA or something like this, but it was certainly, and as I mentioned before, Stan Allen was very influential in terms of his books and his sort of theoretical works looking at how order and organization could be generated outside of you know, sort of classical geometries and so on and so forth, which is what we were trying to say. You know, so definitely I think it was there. I think, you know, computers, you know, being able to work digitally meant that you could work in a very different way. You could create much more complex patterns and such that, you know, there were, I mean, again, you know, I can't use, you know, Rhino and Grasshopper and all of these things. I use simple digital tools like Illustrator and, you know, InDesign. But, you know, I could do things with those in terms of making multiple images that could be stacked and offset and shifted and twisted and slightly distorted here and there. And so I think the, you know, the computer, again, early days in 1997, but it was part of a process of being able to work. I think importantly for me, it was working graphically. That is to say, the image was really important, but the ability to manipulate the image through computational or digital means was also an important development as well. I think what was really interesting was the degree to which, you know, when we did Federation Square, I didn't use it, but people in my office, students basically, could use MicroStation. And we designed and developed all of Federation Square using MicroStation Triforma. And it was really one of the first buildings, certainly in Australia, where we gave a 3D digital model to the engineers. Now, at the time, we couldn't share it, or we didn't share it because nobody was sure who had responsibility if there was a mistake, if we just shared a digital model. So, but we gave the digital model to the engineers, who then effectively kind of redrew it based on our digital model so that it came from their hand. And then that's actually how the atrium structure was formulated, which is a very complex structure. And again, had tolerances of something like 4 millimeters. And yet it came together perfectly. So that move was both from a kind of architectural aspiration in terms of ideas around complexity, but also the, you know, computational means to be able to make that work structurally and then actually get it fabricated and put on site was just happening at that moment for us.
Can I ask you why this project invests so heavily in veering from the default geometric interests of conventional normative legible architecture? In other words, please share with us the reasoning for why the Federation Square project so strongly rejects spatial reductivism, minimalism, and even the conventions of modernism, positing instead complexity expressed in urban patterns and architectural or surface organization.
Well, look, I mean, partly it's just because that's what we became interested in. I mean, you know, I think we all have interests that we take a certain distance and then take another distance, and then maybe it gets shifted. But we did feel that it was about a different kind of understanding of how social and cultural life is at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And that's why when we talk about this kind of offset geometry, it's partly because it allowed, again, it goes back to this desire to produce an architecture of relationships rather than iconic objects, that when you're using, Euclidean geometries, it's very easy to come up with very strongly definable and recognizable entities as objects. And we just felt that part of the complexity of life is that we're not made up of those kind of elements. We don't operate that way. We don't structure our life in clear, undeniably differentiated moments. It all kind of flows together and meshes together and such. And for us, Federation Square is of interest. I mean, the very notion of federation for us is an interesting idea. It's not different than the United States. The idea is that Australia used to be made up of British colonies, and there was a decision made of whether they would form a federation or whether the colonies would each become individual nations. So you could have had the nation of New South Wales and the nation of Victoria, but they chose to federate, to join together. And in federation, that means that there is a whole, again, this question of coherence, but it allows for differences. So you have state parliaments, like this, it's like the United States. The United States has the federal government, a federated government, and you still maintain the state government. So you have this coherence as a whole, as an entity, but you also have the differences. And now sometimes that's problematic, as we've seen in the history of race relationships, of education, and now health and so forth. But, the complexity of daily life is that we live in multiple moments simultaneously. We live in multiple groupings simultaneously. And so we wanted to try to develop an architecture that could not just recognize that and certainly not try to illustrate that, but would help to facilitate the expansion of that as part of civic and social and cultural life.
My next question concerns the envelope technologies developed with the triangular pinwheel grid as the modular basis of the facade systems. How did you conceive of the three different material systems of the sandstone, zinc, and glass? And what led to the decisions for the structure and the transparency of atrium building to be so distinct from the other sandstone and zinc buildings?
Yeah. So when we started developing with the engineers with Atelier 1, the way in which the pinwheel grid could be made operable, it was partly because the building was supposed to have been built within 4 years. And so it actually took 5 years. But that's a pretty fast time when you're building over railways and the complexity and stuff. So we had this sense that we would have to, particularly with the facades, have to develop something that was prefabricated, that could be brought on site. We didn't want curtain walls. We didn't want a kind of curtain wall system that would be done as units and cassettes and then brought in and just laid onto it. But we did feel like, it couldn't possibly be handmade. It couldn't be handmade out of brick or something like this. So we, the pinwheel grid, the Conway pinwheel grid allowed us to be able to produce it as a prefabricated unit. The choice of materials were, I would have to say we didn't spend a huge amount of time thinking about it. We just had to write something in the report for the competition. And we said, okay, let's make it sandstone and zinc is good and, some glass. So, but when we were actually designing it after it won the competition, we spent a lot of time finding the right sandstone because we wanted a sandstone that was variegated, that had tonalities within it, not just a beige, one single sort of color, because what happens that when it rains, the red tonalities that are in the sandstone actually become much stronger. And so the building sort of changes. Zinc, when you first put it on the building, is really shiny, but it patinates over time and turns a different tonality of gray. But it's different depending on its exposure. So the zinc that's facing towards the sun is, after 20 years, is actually quite different than the zinc that's not facing to the sun. Or the zinc that's facing to the west and gets a lot of rain is different from the zinc that's on the east that doesn't get rained on as directly as much and stuff. So we like this idea that the materials show materiality. They're not trying to look like something else. They're actually showing up in themselves. And the perforated zinc was there because we could use it as a kind of shading device, particularly on the SBS building, which are the offices. But it's also there because there are parts where we have ventilation intakes or extracts. And yet we can keep it without it having a different kind of grill over the top of it, because that's where we have an air intake or exhaust of some kind. So it helps to give that coherent wholeness to the piece. And then obviously the glass is because there are times when we need to look out, but sometimes it's kind of opaque glass as well, because it's just there as part of the pattern and such. So, that's where some of the choices came, and they came out of those decisions about using those materials because they have very specific material qualities in their own right.
Can you comment on the dissonance between the twisted ribbon diagram from which the massing derives and the triangular fractal diagram from which the wrappers derive?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mostly I don't like triangles. When my students are doing designs and they come up with a kind of triangular plan or something, I go, oh, it's terrible. Even worse is when they come up with hexagonal plans. I think every student does one hexagonal diagram design in their life. And I always tell students, I said, okay, you've done this now you don't ever have to do a hexagonal plan again. And it's the same a little bit with the triangle. But so I would never never use a triangle in plan. But in the facade, what was nice about it, and this was, again, because of John Conway, this is an aperiodic tiling grid that he developed, which means even though it comes from the simplest thing possible, this golden ratio triangle, it creates an incredible array of different, of variation in terms of how those triangles come together, and which allowed us then to have that big array of figuration on the surfaces of the buildings. I mean, what we ended up with, in terms of the facades, are the result of probably 4,000 drawings of the facade, because everybody in the office for something like 2.5 months, I would say, everybody was drawing the facade. Now, if you lay that grid, that pinwheel grid over, and as I was showing with the colors, you just connect different points. It seemed very simple, but some of those figures were just not nice. We had a whole set called the Bart Simpson facades, because it was all very spiky somehow, like Bart Simpson's hair. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. So we literally just had to, you have to kind of find, it's like, I think of it as like the constellations in the sky, the Big Dipper, the Bear, Scorpio, whatever, they're just random dots in the sky, but somebody saw a figure emerge out of that. And so those facades derived from constantly going through and finding figures, and figures that seemed to work together or didn't work together, and then working through that and stuff. So the triangular grid allowed us that, incredible freedom, but also responsibility. We just literally had to do the work to find figuration. Now, it could have been different. I mean, I could go back today and look at the facade and say, oh, well, maybe we should have had that one be sandstone and that be zinc, or this part here could have been connected to that part here. But it was a way of articulating those surfaces to create different effects from the east to the north to the south to the west, from the gallery building versus the cinema building versus the office building versus the back of the Yarra building, and so on and so forth, you know. So that standardized triangular grid allowed this huge array of different articulations and figurations to emerge.
I'll shift our discussion to the way in which the project was initially received by the architectural community and the public. In the hindsight, after more than 20 years, Federation Square is a civic space which is activated continuously, embedded in the urban communities of Melbourne and the cultural life of the city, and has become much loved. In advance of the Federation Square proposal, Australia and especially Melbourne has been the host of some experimental, unique, and even radical architecture. In retrospect, can you please share with us why there was seemingly so much controversy and so much commentary of this proposal at first?
Well, look, I mean, I think any project that's right in the middle of the city, and in such a, I mean, it's literally across the street from the main railway station where everybody comes in, and it's right on what's called St. Kilda Road that becomes part of Swanston Street, which is the main north-south access throughout Melbourne altogether. So it's just very prominent for one thing. I think some of the controversy was, first of all, because we weren't from Melbourne. You know, there were a lot of Melbourne architects that were angry that some foreigners, I mean, Peter's Australian, but he had been living overseas for the last, 10 or 15 years. And I'm from Texas. Why were they given this major project to these outsiders? That was part of it. And that was certainly part of the architectural community that made, comments about our design. A lot of people, a lot of Melburnians, Victorians, didn't know what a Federation Square was. Nobody had told them. There was just this thing called Federation Square that a lot of public money was being expended on in the middle of the city. When we won the competition, Peter and I offered to, there was an exhibition with the models and our drawings at the town hall, which is close to the site. And we offered to be there for 2 solid days, all day long, at least 8 hours a day, to answer any question of anybody. So we had lots of people coming saying they hated it, say it was terrible, why were they doing this? But we also had people saying, why are you even building these buildings? Why don't they just make it a park? Why don't you just put down some grass? We need more grass and green trees and stuff like this. So nobody really knew what Federation Square was supposed to do. Nothing to do with the architecture, just as a project, as a civic project. There were a lot of people that there are a lot of people that still dislike the architecture. They think it's too jumbly, it's too messed up, it's not coherent enough, it's not ordered enough, and so on and so forth. But, and there were political dimensions to it as well. We have one newspaper here is very conservative. It's like the New York Post, so obviously they hated it because it wasn't traditional. Why couldn't we have a traditional architecture and such? Why couldn't it be something everybody can understand? Why does it have to be so difficult to understand what it's all about? But also because that way they could be against the premier of the day, against the local politicians and stuff. In fact, the opposition, which is a more left wing, the premier that commissioned this is a kind of more on the right wing side of politics, conservative side of politics. And the opposition at that time, which is a Labor, which is more left-leaning, you might say, also came out and said, oh, this is terrible. It has all the grace and charm. This is what the opposition leader said, it has all the grace and charm of Godzilla. It's a monster, basically. Well, 3 years later, they won the election and they had to finish the project. So suddenly, oh, well, sorry, we think it's going to be a great project. And suddenly, and they finished it and they opened it. So the people that had called it Godzilla suddenly were the ones who were backing it, saying it's fantastic, it's going to be great for the economy, and so on and so forth. So, you know, there are multiple strands in terms of all of this. The thing that probably got, and you know, and I mean, I could give you a whole lecture just on things that were in the newspaper about the project, but the one that still hits me the most was there was a writer, again, for this very conservative newspaper, who said that, you know, he wrote this. So this was written, you have to remember, this was written in 2001. So as the building was coming up, it wasn't completed, but it was coming up. And he wrote this, I think in, it was probably July of 2001. And it was not long after in Afghanistan, they had blown up the Buddhas in Afghanistan, right? And he said, oh, if we could just get those guys from Afghanistan to come to Melbourne, maybe they could blow up Federation Square. Now, this was 2 months before 9/11, you know, and this was the attitude that this guy had. So, you know, those are the kind of things you just deal with, you know, you can't fight it directly. But what was interesting, and I give a lot of credit to the government when it changed, that they had an open day where it was still a construction site. So they had to shut down construction for almost a week, put up barriers, put in kind of walkways and ramps and stuff. And they let the public come onto the construction site for 2 days, on a Saturday and a Sunday. And almost overnight, the opinion changed, you know, where before it was probably 60 to 70% against the project and maybe 35% for the project. Within a week of them having the open day on the site, and again, the buildings weren't finished, so you couldn't really figure out exactly what it was going to look like or going to even be, but you got a sense of something. It changed because people, one, they understood what the point was in terms of the galleries and the multimedia spaces and what was going to be a public outside space and what was going to be a covered interior space like the atriums and so on and so forth. But it was also, it was no longer going to be this little cake that was going to be wrapped up and handed to the public when it was finished. They actually had ownership of it. And that was an important moment also in its reception. And then once it did open, it really just became the place you go to. So now it is really, you know, people say, I'll just meet you at Fed Square and then we'll decide where we're going to go for the day or where we're going to go for the night and stuff. So it really has become, you know, it's a destination because of what's there, but it's also just the starting point. Is what you might call the home page for Melbourne. It's where you go to first before you decide where else to go.
It has been more than 20 years since Federation Square was completed. Can you share with us your perspective of any changes in the perception of the public in Melbourne towards the architecture and urban design of Federation Square?
Well, like I said, it's just, you know, it's just the place people go to, you know, it's the place I mean, a lot of this has nothing to do with the architecture. I mean, there's a management company that runs Federation Square, and they put on something like 2,000 events every year. You know, Melbourne is a very multicultural city, and therefore, you know, one day it'll be, you know, India National Day, one day it'll be the Chinese National Day, one day it'll be the Sri Lankan National Day, one day it'll be the Peruvian National Day, you know, and we have all of these cultures here, and so it's used for that. But it's also hosts big events. Melbourne is really a city that does a lot of festivals. We have a film festival, a comedy festival, a fashion festival, a food and wine festival, and it goes on and on. And a lot of times, some of those events take place at Federation Square. Sometimes they take place, you know, kind of around there and everything. I think the thing that hits me the most, we had the celebration. So back in October was the 20th anniversary. And there was a formal celebration, but then the next day we did another celebration, which was just the people that worked on it. And, you know, altogether, there was something like 4,000 people. Now, in my office, it was only 100 people. But there were overall 4,000 people, you know, engineers, construction, consultants, all kinds of stuff. And the most gratifying thing to me is the number of people that worked on it, not necessarily directly with us as architects. It could have been engineers, it could have been construction, whatever, people that come up, you know, during the anniversary celebrations and said, you know, this was the best project I ever worked on. You know, it's the one I remember the most. And so I think that sense of camaraderie that developed, but also I think the experience, you know, we were trying to do something different. We were trying to do something, you know, not iconic, but something that would change the way Melbourne operated. And I think it did change the way Melbourne operates.
In general, do you believe it is important for an architect's decisions and interests and the product as built spaces to be perceived as comprehensible and legible by lay people or the general public?
Well, I take I mean, again, this, you know, it's a kind of cliche, but, you know, for me, the difference between Melbourne and Sydney is a difference between experience and image. You know, that, you know, you can go to Sydney and I can tell you where the spot is to take the photograph, where you get the Opera House and the bridge. And there's a kind of sense, you know, as a tourist, sometimes you go to cities and you want to make sure you take the photograph that was on the cover of the book about the city you've just come to visit, so that you can say you've been to that. And by taking that photograph, it kind of proves you've been there because you've seen what was on the cover of that book. And Melbourne's different. I think, you know, Melbourne, when we have visitors to Melbourne and I kind of take them around, chaperone them around, you know, it takes about an hour, because to really get a sense of it, you have to go through a lot of different spaces. You have to wander through these laneways and arcades and passageways and open up to, you know, I mean, looking at particular buildings, yes, definitely. But it's really a city that, you know, you have to experience. And so it's demanding in one sense, because you can't just be given the image and say, oh, okay, I understand it. You actually have to engage it. And so, you know, for me, that's great. I mean, I'm happy with that. And certainly we thought of that a lot with Fed Square, that we wanted to create a place that won't make sense the first time, not because we're trying to hide anything, but it can only make sense by experiencing it. You know, and it's sort of, it's not that it grows on you so much, but that it makes sense by making it make sense. You have to be there and be part of it for it to make sense.
A deck was built above the existing railway lines, re-establishing a civic space and connection between the city and the Yarra River, making of a new inclusive civic space which is activated by the public non-stop. Did the public migrate to and activate this urban space immediately upon its opening?
Yeah, it's interesting. We in Australia, so the building was, the official opening was October the 24th, I think it was, in 2002. And it wasn't complete. There was still one, in fact, the Yarra building was still under construction, and what we call what do we call it? The building that's sort of on the corner overlooking the river, which is a cafe and restaurant, was still being constructed. And on the backside of that building is where we have the big video screen. The video screen was in and it was commissioned, but they hadn't yet got all the sound up and working. Anyway, on the first Tuesday of November every year, Melbourne hosts something called the Melbourne Cup, which is a horse racing festival. And so there's a big race called the Melbourne Cup, which happens at 2:20 on the first Tuesday of every November. And it's a public holiday here. So we get a public holiday because of the horse racing, which is kind of unusual. But all over Australia, people put a bet down. It's a big day. People watch it. Even in other states where it's not a holiday, they watch it on TV and put down bets and everything. We were in our office and we said, oh, well, let's go see, because we knew that they were going to show it on the screen at Federation Square. And so we left our office, which was a few blocks away from Federation Square. And as we were walking towards Federation Square, we could just, you could just kind of see a line of people headed that way. Because it's the middle of the afternoon. It's not like people were going to work. They were on holiday, but somehow there was just a kind of trail on all the streets that converged towards Federation Square. And as we got there, the square was filling up. It wasn't completely full, but the square was filling up of people who just knew this was the place to go. And so we watched the horse race without sound. It didn't actually have the commentators announcing who's winning and who's in first and all this, but we watched it on the screen, and it was just this kind of gravitation to it. And that has become that whenever there's a public event like the World Cup for soccer or the Olympics or stuff, you'll just see a kind of line of people heading that way. So it has become you just know stuff is going to be happening there. And so people go.
So we are interested in the relationships of Federation Square to the body of work of Lab Architecture Studio and your more broad background as an educator for 15 years before proposing the Federation Square project. Were there projects, research or teaching which had served as the springboard and led to your proposal for Federation Square? Or in other words, what was the genealogy of ideas, concepts and techniques which foregrounded your work on Federation Square?
Well, as I said before, when Peter and I started Lab in 1994, Peter had been practicing. He had his own small office in London, mostly doing bars, cafes, residential renovations or additions and stuff. I had mostly been teaching. I'd had, taught at the AA, and then I had the school in France, and then I came back to the AA, and I was head of media studies. I had worked for Libeskind on a couple of projects, competitions. I had worked in offices in Houston and elsewhere before. So when we started together, the only way to really start doing anything was just competitions. So one of the first competitions we did was for the Cardiff Bay Opera House that was won by Zaha, but then wasn't built. There was another competition for a project in Scotland, which was an architecture and design center. So we did that competition. We did another competition in Australia, which was called the Wagga Wagga Civic Centre. So Wagga Wagga is a town in New South Wales. And we got shortlisted on that. So we were one of 5 on that, but we didn't win the project. But there are a lot of aspects of that project that help to feed into Federation Square. But the projects that we did before, so Federation Square was our 16th project. So the 15 projects before were all competitions, and they had different aspects. Some of them you could say were related, or Federation Square was related to the work we had done some of those, but some of them were quite different. They were looking at different ways of partly because the brief was very, very different. It wasn't a whole precinct. Most of the other projects were singular buildings of one kind or another. So there was, we were building up a body of work. And we felt like, whether we win a competition or not, it's a way of building up a body of work and a body of ideas, and that those ideas would get rethought about and reconfigured and reanimated in other projects, or part of them would. And then that would lead to new research and new stuff. We called it Lab because it really came out of the notion of it being a laboratory. The idea was, it wasn't called Davidson and Bates about us. It was really, we called it Lab as a laboratory. And the school that I had in France had a very somewhat pretentious name called the Laboratory of Primary Studies in Architecture. So LOPSIA, LOPSIA, which we shortened, but it was called the Laboratory of Primary Studies in Architecture. So when we started the practice, we called it Lab as a kind of shortening of laboratory, because we felt that that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to experiment. We wanted to test different ideas out. So we didn't feel like there was just one idea. There were many ideas, and different projects allowed for the articulation and the development and the expansion of those ideas. So Federation Square was a part of that. There are ideas in Federation Square that came from previous projects, And there are things that we did in Federation Square that we used on other projects later as it developed.
How did the Federation Square project influence your thinking about architecture since its completion?
Well, the thing that it's interesting because when we did Fed Square, you know, when we started Fed Square, we had an office of 4, Peter and myself, and 2 students from the AA. As we got into the project and got close to the deadline for stage 1, we had 3 or 4 more students join us and do some work with us. And we started talking to some engineers, and we had Atelier 10 and Atelier 1 across the street. And we had a landscape architect, cartesian from the Netherlands, and they put in some ideas. When we got shortlisted, then we got, you know, when we finally ended up on the second stage, we had, I think, 21 people working on it in the office. So we had 2 people that came from London. We had a few more students. We had some older friends that were helping out. We had some people pitch in at the very last minute and so on and so forth. But we thought that we would probably go to Melbourne, do the project for 2 or 3 years, and then come back to London and such. But what we realized was that because Federation Square was a huge project, and it was our first project, so it's the first building I've ever built that I've designed, you know, we realized that for that kind of project or projects of that scale and dimension, you know, it's not just that you need a big office, but you need a lot of really good people because you can't do it yourself. When you're doing a competition, every competition, no matter what project, is the same size. It's 4 A1 panels, you know. So whether you're doing a project like Federation Square or you're doing the competition for the Guggenheim Bilbao, or you're a competition for a new city in China, it's 4 A1 panels. And so you can manage that with, you know, a certain number of people. But when you start doing a project that gets built, then suddenly not just that the size of the project demands more people, but the expertise and the ability, you know. So I had to hire a lot of people to tell them, I had to hire a lot of people so that they could tell me what I needed to do to tell them what to do, if that makes any sense. You know, I had to tell people, you know, I had to hire people that could say, well, this is what we need to do on the facades and how we need to document it. What do you want us to do? And then I would have to think about it and say, okay, well, let's do this. And then they would do that, you know. So I had to have people that knew much more about building buildings than I did. And yet I had to also, you know, control it or develop it or lead it, as it were. So I think the thing that became clear is that, you know, we could have gone back to London when Fed Square finished, and then we would have to start all over again because those people that had helped us so much would stay in Australia, and we'd have to find a whole new group. So that's why we ended up staying in Australia, staying in Melbourne, is because of the people, you know, the people who we could depend on, who could articulate and help us to develop ideas and to turn them into architectural possibilities. We just didn't want to have to start over again because we depended on those people. So that for me was the real thing that we learned out of the difference between working on competitions as a starting point and then moving into another kind of scale of development.
Can you share with us the impact of the Federation Square project on Lab's project afterwards?
Well, you know, the irony is we never had another project in Australia. So even though I've stayed here for 26 years now, we've never done another project or another building in Australia. So we did lots more competitions. I mean, we got shortlisted on, you know, at the very end of Federation Square, we did 2 competitions at the same time. You know, we were doing a project, it was a competition for Brisbane that we were shortlisted, but we didn't win. We did a competition for BMW in Leipzig, which we got 2nd place on to Zaha Hadid, who got to build the project, unfortunately for us, good project for them. We did projects back in Europe, we did projects in Taiwan, we did stuff. And then one day, Peter, we had done a competition project in Taiwan, Peter had gone to Taiwan to present it. When he was in Hong Kong, somebody said, oh, you should go to Beijing and give a lecture. He was in Beijing and gave a lecture, and we got invited to do a competition for a project in Beijing with a group called Soho China. And we did that, and we won the competition. And so that was our second building, was 170,000 square meter residential and commercial and office building, two tower project in Beijing. And then once we did that, then we started getting invited for projects in China. Peter was doing those. I went and taught at Cooper Union for a year and a half, and passed through the Middle East on the way and back to Europe, and was invited we got an award in Dubai. I met a friend who lived there, found out that the Victorian government had a business office. I went there. They took me around, and I met maybe 24 developers in Dubai. And then we got commissioned to do a few projects there, or to do some competitions. And then we set up an office in Dubai. And so we had an office in Beijing, and we had an office in Dubai. And then we got invited to give a lecture in Mumbai, and I went to Mumbai. And then we got invited to do some projects in India. So we ended up setting up an office in Delhi for a while. So, that's just the way it worked for us. We were based here in Melbourne, but we never got anything back in Australia. So we just went where we could get projects.
How has your teaching and your perspective as an academic leader been influenced by the achievements of building Federation Square?
Yeah, it's been influenced a lot. I mean, look, I still have some of the same theoretical or conceptual interests and, things that I study, that I research, that I look at, and such. So I'm certainly not somebody who, oh, well, I've built a building, so now I know what buildings are like, and you have to change the way you think. You have to be more pragmatic. You have to be, much more. I wish I was a better business person. We would have saved some money probably. But I think from in terms of my interest in architecture, they remain as theoretical and as conceptual as before. I think with students, a lot has changed since I was first teaching to what it takes to teach now. But some of the fundamentals that I'm interested in remain the same, So, I have to leave here in a minute and go give another lecture up at the university, which is all about the line. And when I first was saying, that for me, the line is the fundamental tool of architecture, because it's how we make difference. And part of the role of the architect is not difference in terms of difference in the world, but, what we do differentiates the world, between inside and outside, between public and private, between social space and non-social space, between civic and so on and so forth. So, I think some of those things still are the same. How we produce those kind of lines and how we understand through different new production techniques and technologies of thinking about spatial relationships and spatial organization, I think have changed. And, that's what I try to discuss with students now.
Your presentation and this interview in this series, Beyond the Envelope, are set within a Master of Architecture course here at NYIT. In this context, can you please share with us, from your point of view, any advice you may have for the next generation of architects?
Gosh. Well, look, I think the thing that I have the most trouble with currently is there's just so much to know, I lament, our school, different from the American system, but much like all of Europe, we have a 3-year undergraduate program for a bachelor degree, and then a 2-year master program for a Master of Architecture degree. So it's still only 5 years. My undergraduate was a 5-year, and then I did 3 years of my master. And I just feel like there's not enough hours in the day, enough teaching hours, and enough learning hours to learn what one needs to learn to be, a contemporary architect. And so it's frustrating sometimes, because everything that our students are learning is absolutely fundamental and necessary, but there are other things they're not getting a chance to learn, and they're not expected to as part of their degree. Now, they may come back and do a PhD, but it's just, for me, being given a master's degree with only 5 years of complete study just seems undercooked. I think it would really take minimum of 6 or if not 7 years and stuff. So, I think it's hard, because I just think, it's like everything that I studied up until 1978, when I graduated with my undergraduate degree, all of that is still necessary. And then there's everything that we've learned since 1978 that's necessary. So I think if anything, school years should be increasing rather than decreasing, because there's just so much to know. And there's just and it's great stuff. It's really stuff I want to. It's not like it's not a chore. It's not a task. It's like, I remain very thirsty for knowledge and experience, and the schools are just too short. I know you don't want to hear that as a student, because you'd like to get out sooner rather than later, but I think you should stay longer, personally.
Thank you very much for this special opportunity to interview today, and for your generosity to share your work, thoughts, and reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the group and NYT, I'd also like to thank Tom Verabis for organizing the seminar. I'd like to thank Hashmi for her gracious conducting of the interview on behalf of the entire class. And I'd like to thank you, Don, for generously sharing this project with us, and for your candid insights into its conception, development, execution, and for your reflections. I'd also like to invite everyone to join us for next week's event, presentation and interview with Yosuke Hayano of Mad Architects, also at 6 p.m. New York time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And
thank you, Don.
thank you. Bye, Pablo. Bye, Tom.